Chapter 2: Presentation Delivery. The content of your presentation is important, but to give the content the best chance of being understood and engaged with by the audience, there are a number of things to think about in terms of the delivery itself. Think of these as different tools that you can use to help your audience. They include pausing, intonation, speech rate, volume, body orientation, positioning, and gesture. Let's look at some sample presentations to explore how these tools can be put to use. Pauses allow the audience to consider a question or point. Plan ahead about where to pause. Commas and full stops are good clues.
I'm going to talk about nuclear energy. And more specifically, I'm going to argue that we shouldn't use it. And we should use renewable forms of energy instead. I think these two arguments are very strong, and they do need to be considered carefully. But I think they have flaws, as I explain now. The first argument commits a fallacy, which is known as the sunk cost fallacy.
Intonation can help your presentation to sound more interesting and lively, but also helps your audience to interpret your words. Intonation is a clue to meaning, so use this to make it easier for your audience to understand you.
I'm going to talk about nuclear energy, and more specifically, I'm going to argue that we shouldn't use it, and instead, we should use renewable forms of energy. I think these two arguments are very strong, and they do need to be considered carefully. But I think they have flaws, as I'll explain now. The first argument commits a fallacy which is known as the sunk cost fallacy.
Asking questions can make your presentation interesting and engaging. Clearly state questions with a proper intonation. A falling intonation is used for when, where, why, or how questions, while a rising intonation is used for questions that can be answered by yes or no.
So how do we investigate this? So are these data consistent with my hypothesis?
Like intonation, varying your speed can make your presentation sound more lively, but it can also help your audience understand. You may want to slow down, especially when you are introducing a new expression that your audience may not have heard before, so that they can hear it properly.
The first argument commits a fallacy which is known as the sunk cost fallacy.
And when you are indicating something on the graph, give your audience time to follow where you are pointing.
This graph shows my results. It summarizes the speed of the wind that reached the turbine, which is represented by the line graph in red, and the turbine's output, which is demonstrated by the blue bar graph.
Keep the back of the room in mind when you are thinking about how loud to speak. People won't understand you if they can't hear you.
I would like to present the results of my study. On the influence of obstacle layout on the efficiency.
When you are having a conversation with someone, how you stand communicates various things about your attitude towards the conversation and person you are talking to. It is the same when talking to a group of people as a presenter. But standing in front of an audience is not something we do often, so we don't have natural habits of how to stand or move. Here are some things to consider. Posture starts even before speaking and sets the tone of your message. Some things to remember are: face the audience in order to include them. Facing away can make an audience feel excluded.
In this talk, I will argue for the abolishment of nuclear energy.
Leaning on furniture can make an audience think that you are not giving them your full energy.
The issue of nuclear energy is very divisive, especially perhaps in Japan. The issue of nuclear energy is very divisive, especially perhaps in Japan, given its rather unique experience with it.
When we are nervous, we often move about and sway. By staying relatively still, you automatically look more confident.
I'm going to talk about nuclear energy, and more specifically, I'm going to argue that we shouldn't use it. I'm going to talk about nuclear energy, and more specifically, I'm going to argue that we shouldn't use it.
You can direct the attention of the audience using your body. When you are talking about something on the screen, turn to include it in your field of vision, but keep the audience visible too, since you are still talking to them. When explaining something in the visual aid, point to it and use the hand nearest to the screen.
One thing I'd like to point out is the sudden increase in wind speed recorded at the 20 centimeter gap you can see at this point.
Use your hands or a pointer to lead the attention of your audience more specifically. When you are finished pointing out something on the screen, be sure to turn back to your audience fully. Gesturing can be a great aid for the audience to understand you better.
To test different configurations in different trials, we vary the distance between the two plastic bottles from 0 to 40 centimeters in 10 centimeter increments.
Keeping eye contact with your audience helps them feel connected to your presentation.